Government not to withdraw funding request for preliminary work in Northeastern New Territory project. Survey results from a newly formed political reform concern group. And the US moves an aircraft carrier into the Persian Gulf.
Good evening. Secretary for Development Paul Chan is standing firm on his bid to seek funding for preliminary work in the Northeast New Territories Development Plan. He said today that protesters who tried to storm the Legislative Council building Friday night have misguided anger, but the protesters insist the government is not listening. Paul Chan said today there are lots of erroneous facts and figures being circulated in public. He said a lawmaker criticised him last week for not talking to villagers in Pingche about compensation, but in fact Pingche has already been taken out of the development plan.
The fact is, I did visit them. I did have met them. And I did take the initiative to go to the affected areas. To be fair to our colleagues, they have tried very hard. And we even set up 2 social services teams. One in Kudong North, the other in Fanning North. And these 2 social services team is to help enhance the dialogue with the people and to explain things. Our door is open.
He stressed that with Hong Kong's need for development, it's just not possible or reasonable to refuse any change at all. Many accuse him of pushing ahead with a project before the Town Planning Board has approved it. But Chan said funding being sought by the government is only for preliminary work, not for the actual development project. And he's just trying to shorten the waiting time for procedures to go forward.
This is a small funding for preliminary works, for site investigation, so as to prepare us if this particular project got the green light, then we can proceed further to ensure the housing supply will be available in 2023, 9 years from now, even if we work full speed.
But groups opposing the development project today defended their actions. Demonstrator Che Kai Kai said behind the radical acts, there is systemic violence by the rich and powerful that has led to people's anger boiling over. She stressed that they have a goal to stop the development project and that as soon as the protesters heard that the LegCo Finance Committee had been suspended, their actions started to simmer down. And Li Siwa from a Kutong concern group hit back at criticisms by a government official that the violent acts were not carried out by indigenous people of the affected areas, but by 6 radical groups. My group was named and I was born and bred there, said Li. He said the government was just trying to drive a wedge between the various groups of demonstrators.
A survey commissioned by a newly formed political reform concern group has found that more than half of the respondents think civil nomination of chief executive candidates is not against the basic law. But it also shows the majority of those surveyed think that even without a satisfactory nomination procedure, the 2017 CE election should still be held using the one-man, one-vote system. Rani Samtani with details.
Among those in the newly formed concern group are Democratic Party members Fred Lee and Tik Chi-yoon, Centerline founder Shi Wing-ching, and former information coordinator of the Chief Executive's office, Andy Ho. Last month, with the help of Lingnan University, the group polled around 1,000 people. Results show more than half of those surveyed believed universal suffrage should still be adopted in the 2017 chief executive election, even if they are dissatisfied with the nomination process. More than half of the respondents also believe civil nomination of candidates does not violate the basic law. The concern group said it hopes the poll will spur more discussion on reform and stressed that it has no political affiliation. Meanwhile, Elsie Leung, vice chairwoman of the Basic Law Committee, reiterated that the white paper recently released by the State Council is just a clarification of the one country, two systems principle, and that it did not undermine the city's high degree of autonomy. She added that Occupy Central's civil referendum this month won't have any impact on political development in the SAR. But Occupy Central movement organizer Diane To believes Beijing published the white paper to deter people from voting next weekend.
It has no legal effect, but the number of people voting in the civil referendum will surely affect the political bargaining in the later stage. And so it is very reasonable to say that the white paper, at least part of its objective, is targeting at the voting rate of the civil referendum.
Regarding last Friday's violent protests at the Legislative Council, Tai said he's confident that the civil disobedience movement will be peaceful.
There may be a small number of people may use a more violent attitude in the action, but if the majority can maintain the peaceful spirit, I think their impact will be very little, and we will be able to maintain the peaceful spirit.
He explained that his team has been training the participants and supporters in preparation for the movement. Rani Santani, TVB News.
And overseas now, Iraqi government forces say they've managed to slow a northern offensive by Islamic militants. As the crisis continues, Washington has begun to lay out conditions for possible U.S. assistance in the conflict. James Aitken reports.
Heeding a call to arms by a Shiite cleric, thousands of men from southern Iraqi cities are volunteering to join the battle against a breakaway al-Qaeda militant group known as ISIL. Send us to fight ISIL, they chant. The recruits will need their newfound enthusiasm if they eventually confront the militants. The Sunni extremists have seized much of northern Iraq in lightning raids that have sent Iraqi forces fleeing, abandoning their arms and military equipment in the process. But the Sunni Islamist offensive that is threatening to dismember the country has shown signs of slowing. Government forces say they have regained some territory in counterattacks against militant targets. On the streets of the capital, Baghdad, it's business as usual. The situation is very normal, says this Baghdad resident. If it wasn't, you would not find us here eating and drinking. But the reality on the ground in the north, where militants have dug in and continue to press, is very different. The United Nations estimates 1 million people have been displaced by the conflict. And in a country that could quickly descend into civil war, observers say any use of force must be carefully calibrated.
We're seeing a very serious threat to the sovereignty and the integrity of this country. And that threat needs to be dealt with. It cannot be dealt with only militarily, but it cannot be dealt with only politically, because your opponent is a very determined organization, group of people who seek to destroy the state.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon has ordered an aircraft carrier into the Gulf in case Washington decides to pursue a military option against the insurgents. But American officials continue to insist that any U.S. assistance to Iraq can only work if Iraqi leaders overcome deep divisions and work towards building national unity. James Aitken, TVB News.
A roadside bomb has killed 11 people in northern Afghanistan, including 4 election workers. In a separate attack, the Taliban cut off the fingers of nearly a dozen people to punish them for voting in this weekend's presidential runoff. Officials say voting has been relatively peaceful despite a series of scattered attacks that have killed 47 people. The Taliban had warned people not to vote in Saturday's election. The 2 candidates are the front-runner, former Foreign Minister Abdullah Abdullah, and former Finance Minister Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai. They've both promised to improve ties with the West and signed a delayed security pact to allow U.S. troops to remain in the country for 2 more years. Official preliminary results are expected on July the 2nd.
In Europe, Ukraine's president has promised a tough response against separatist rebels who shot down a military transport in the east of the country. The incident, which left 49 people dead, drew strong condemnation from around the world.
Я пишаюся українськими військовослужбовцями.
Ukraine's new president declared today a day of mourning and vowed to punish those responsible for the downing of a military transport in the east of the country. President Petro Poroshenko called for a detailed analysis of the reasons that led to the plane's demise, ordering better protection for aircraft used to ferry troops, supplies and equipment in the country. His office also hinted that senior personnel changes were imminent in the wake of yesterday's disaster. All 49 troops and crew on board were killed while the plane was making its final approach to Luhansk airport. It was a bitter setback for the Ukrainian forces, the deadliest single incident yet in their escalating battle against an armed rebellion in the east of the country. Luhansk, a city near the border with Russia, is one of two eastern areas where separatists have seized government buildings and declared independence. The incident drew condemnation and concern from the White House, European Union leaders, as well as UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. Russia has repeatedly denied any direct support for Ukrainian separatists, but that seemed to fall on deaf ears as protesters staged a violent demonstration outside the Russian embassy in Kiev. Windows were smashed, while cars were overturned and burned around the embassy compound. And NATO waded in to refute Russian claims that it's not involved in the insurgency in eastern Ukraine. It released images last night which it said showed recent Russian tank movements near the border with Ukraine. It followed claims on Friday by the White House that Russia had sent tanks and rocket launchers to the rebels. Israel has detained scores of Palestinians in retaliation for what it says was a Hamas plot to kidnap 3 Israeli teenagers. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned of serious consequences for the kidnappers. The 80 Palestinians, among them top members of Hamas and members of the group's legislative council, were arrested in and around Hebron and across the West Bank. The 2 16-year-olds and a third man, aged 19, disappeared on Thursday night in the West Bank, where they were seminary students at a Jewish settlement.
Japan has reportedly completed the deployment of anti-ship missiles on the Pacific Gateway island of Miyako. The move is aimed at boosting the defense of remote islands. Reports say the latest batch of Type 88 surface-to-ship missiles arrived at Miyako early this month. The missiles cover the areas around the disputed islands, which are known as the Senkakus in Japan and the Diaoyus in China. They also pose a threat to Chinese warships that use the Miyako Strait to enter the Western Pacific. There are also reports that Japan plans to deploy nearly 200 newly developed Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles on the southern island of Kyushu by 2016. These missiles will further strengthen deterrence against any Chinese use of force over the Diaoyu Islands.
Arson attacks and clashes between Bangladeshi locals and Urdu-speaking residents in Bangladesh's capital left 10 people dead. Police said the clashes broke out early on Saturday at a shanty town in Dhaka where the Urdu-speaking people live. Later in the day, unidentified people set fire to homes in the shanty town. Police believe the clashes were over disputes about the illegal use of electricity. Authorities have ruled out that the violence was part of any ethnic tension.
And still to come in our news tonight. A pilot project dealing with solid waste in Macau. The Middle Road multi-storey car park will soon close down. And England lose their opening match in the World Cup to Italy.
Talk about awesomeness. Colombia sprinted out of the starting gate, and the Battle of the Americas went on, while Italy's Balotelli came back to haunt England with a decisive goal. And Côte d'Ivoire prevailed despite Japan's resilience. 2014 FIFA World Cup Brazil daily highlights. Tonight at 8 on Pearl.
香港儲物室帶俾你一個環境舒適、設備更完善嘅精品級迷你倉，俾你更自在嘅儲物空間，珍惜擁有。以專業及真誠嘅心服務顧客，不斷創新改進，滿足你嘅需要。你嘅生活儲物夥伴，香港儲物室，精品級迷你倉特設升級隨你搬服務，令你儲物更輕鬆。
Direct Asia, best price guaranteed on car insurance. That's a wrap. DirectAsia.com, best price guaranteed on car insurance. Easy.
使咩遮啊？你都做咗 dermis 咯，唔止冇生花，連毛孔都快咗。